They declared his yard community property without his consent, planning to build a pool. The HOA president smugly told James to take it to court if he dared. They thought he'd back down, but they didn't know the evidence he had. What happened next shook the entire neighborhood. Let's start from the beginning. James Whitaker had always found peace in the simplicity of his home. The small house in suburban Georgia wasn't much to outsiders, but for him, it was everything. The backyard was his sanctuary, shaded by a towering oak tree that had stood for generations. It was the last place where he and his late wife had shared quiet mornings, sipping coffee and dreaming about the future. Every blade of grass, every weathered stone in the yard held a memory. It was his refuge from the world, a place where nothing, absolutely nothing, was supposed to change. But peace is a fragile thing, and that sunny afternoon, it shattered. James pulled a thick envelope from his mailbox, its weight unsettling in his hand. The HOA logo was stamped on the front, bold and official, as if daring him to open it. He frowned, already bracing for bad news. Inside was a glossy brochure with images of families laughing by a sparkling pool. The text boasted of a community improvement project that promised to enhance property values and bring neighbors together. Then his eyes landed on the fine print. The proposed location for this new community pool was his backyard. For a moment, James just stood there, stunned. His backyard? His private sanctuary? He flipped the pages, hoping he'd misunderstood. But there it was, spelled out in cold, bureaucratic language. The HOA claimed his yard was an underutilized space and perfect for their project. The thought of strangers trampling over his memories, turning his haven into a noisy playground, made his blood boil. That evening, James stormed into the HOA meeting, his hands clenched into fists. The room buzzed with polite chatter, but he had no patience for niceties. "Linda!" he barked, locking eyes with the HOA president. Linda March was a sharp-dressed woman with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise at his outburst. "James," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "how can we help you?" "Help me," he snapped. "You think you're helping me by stealing my backyard?" Linda's smile didn't waver. "It's not stealing, James. It's a community initiative. The HOA has rights, and this project will benefit everyone." "Benefit everyone," he echoed, his voice rising. "It's my yard, Linda. You can't just take it." Her smirk widened, and she leaned forward, lowering her voice just enough to make it personal. "Oh, but we can. The HOA has rights, James. You'll see." That night, James sat in his armchair, staring out the window at his oak tree. The moonlight cast long shadows across the grass, and his mind raced. He couldn't shake Linda's smug expression or the threat in her voice. This wasn't just a proposal, it was a battle for control of his home, and James wasn't about to back down. James woke to an unfamiliar sound, machinery. Pulling back his curtain, his heart sank. Surveyors were staking flags across his backyard, the very yard that had been his sanctuary for decades. Men in vests moved quickly, indifferent to the oak tree or the memories it sheltered. Throwing on his robe, James stormed outside, his voice cutting through the morning air. "What's going on here?" The workers ignored him, but then Linda March appeared, clipboard in hand, and her signature smirk firmly in place. "We're preparing for construction," she said smoothly. "The community pool, remember?" "This is my yard," James barked. "You can't just take it." Linda barely blinked. "Actually, we can. It's all in the bylaws. The amendment passed months ago. Didn't you get the notice?" Her tone was icy and dismissive. "You can fight it, James, but you'll lose." James's blood boiled. "I never voted for this," he spat. Linda gave him a cold smile. "The bylaws are clear. It's legal." She turned to the surveyors. "Carry on?" By nightfall, the surveyors were gone, but their flags and markings remained, slicing through his yard like scars. James sat in his kitchen, the weight of the situation sinking in. His phone trembled in his hand as he dialed a lawyer, laying out every painful detail. The lawyer confirmed his fears. "They're exploiting a loophole. If the amendment wasn't properly passed, we might have a chance, but it won't be easy." James's jaw tightened. "Easy doesn't matter. This is my home. I'm not giving up." And with that, he resolved to fight. knowing this was no longer just about a yard. It was about standing up for everything he held dear. The battle had begun. James wasn't the type to give up, and he certainly wasn't going to let Linda March trample over his rights without a fight. Determined to uncover the truth, he began knocking on neighbors' doors. At first, the responses were mixed. Some people hadn't even heard of the amendment, while others nervously admitted they'd received strange letters from the HOA. These letters, full of legal jargon, hinted that opposing the pool could result in increased fees or even penalties. The more James heard, the angrier he became. It wasn't just about him. This was a scheme designed to intimidate and silence the entire community. The turning point came when James visited Carla, a retired teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years. She welcomed him into her tidy living room, offering him a cup of tea as she listened to his story. When he mentioned the so-called vote, Carla frowned. "Oh, I was there," she said. "It was a sham from the start. Linda ran the whole thing like a puppet show." James leaned forward, his heart racing. "What do you mean?" Carla hesitated, glancing toward the window as if checking for prying eyes. Then she lowered her voice. "Linda used proxies to stack the vote. Half the people who supported the amendment weren't even present, and anyone who raised concerns was ignored. I've never seen anything so dishonest." But the real bombshell came next. Carla reached into a drawer and pulled out a small recording device. "I thought something like this might happen," she admitted, "so I recorded the meeting." James's hands trembled as he pressed play. Linda's voice crackled to life, cold and calculating. "We need to push this through before anyone realizes what's happening. Once the pool is built, there's nothing they can do." Hearing those words was like a jolt of electricity. James finally had the proof he needed. Thanking Carla profusely, he left with a renewed sense of purpose. By the end of the day, he'd filed an emergency injunction to halt construction, attaching the recording as key evidence. But Linda wasn't about to back down. Within days, James received a series of fines from the HOA, each more absurd than the last. His hedge was improperly trimmed. A wind chime on his porch was labeled an unauthorized ornament. It was clear Linda was trying to wear him down, but James refused to be intimidated. Each letter only fueled his determination. The fines piled up, but so did his resolve. This wasn't just about stopping a pool anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who thought she was untouchable. James knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone anymore. The community was watching, and he was ready to lead the charge for justice. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people filed in, their curiosity palpable. On one side sat James, calm but resolute, his lawyer by his side. On the other, Linda March, exuding smug confidence, as if the case had already been decided in her favor. Her expensive blazer and sharp posture made it clear she wasn't used to losing. As proceedings began, Linda's attorney tried to frame the community pool project as a noble endeavor. He painted James as a stubborn man, unwilling to embrace change for the greater good. Linda sat back, arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. But James's lawyer wasn't about to let them control the narrative. When his turn came, he calmly stood and addressed the judge, presenting a series of arguments that poked holes in the HOA's claims. Then, with a deliberate pause, he introduced the key piece of evidence, Carla's recording. The courtroom fell silent as the audio began to play. Linda's voice echoed through the room, her words cold and calculated. "James can whine all he wants, but this pool is happening. He's just an old man clinging to useless land." The atmosphere shifted immediately. Gasps rippled through the room as Linda's true intentions were laid bare. Her smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic. The judge's eyes narrowed, his expression stern as he stopped the recording. Mrs. March," he said, his tone measured but firm. "Would you care to explain this?" Linda stammered, fumbling for an excuse, but the judge raised a hand, signaling her to stop. "We'll get to that shortly," he said, turning to James's lawyer. "Please proceed." With precision, James's lawyer revealed a trail of financial irregularities tied directly to Linda. Documents showed that funds earmarked for the community pool had been funneled into a personal account under the guise of construction expenses. The evidence was damning, and the room erupted in hushed whispers. Linda's confidence crumbled entirely as the truth unraveled. She leaned forward, whispering frantically to her attorney, but it was too late. The judge's decision was swift and unequivocal. The amendment was declared invalid, the construction project halted, and an audit of the HOA's finances was ordered. James sat quietly as the verdict was read, a wave of relief washing over him. Justice had prevailed, but it wasn't just his victory. It was a stand against greed and manipulation. Linda left the courtroom with her head down, the weight of public disgrace pressing heavily on her shoulders. For James, the fight wasn't just about his backyard. It was about proving that even the most entrenched systems of power could be challenged. And as he stepped outside into the bright sunlight, he felt a renewed sense of hope. Not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever been told they couldn't fight back. The restraining order was like a thunderclap that silenced the chaos. Construction halted immediately, the surveyor's stakes disappeared, and the machines that had invaded James's sanctuary were gone overnight. The once confident Linda March, who had loomed over the neighborhood like a storm cloud, now faced a reckoning she hadn't anticipated. News of Linda's removal as HOA president spread quickly. Her downfall wasn't just about the recording or the embezzlement. It was about the community finally seeing her for who she really was. The criminal charges against her for misusing HOA funds sealed her fate, leaving no room for her usual smug deflections. Neighbors whispered about the hefty fines she'd face and the public embarrassment of her actions being exposed. The HOA, desperate to salvage its reputation, was ordered to pay James's legal fees and issue refunds for every fine Linda had unfairly imposed. For many in the neighborhood, it was the first time they felt the HOA was being held accountable. The tide had turned, and James had become the catalyst for that change. James, however, remained humble. When neighbors stopped by to thank him, praising his courage and determination, he would wave them off with a small smile. "I didn't do this for recognition," he said quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." This was about protecting what's mine and proving that bullies, no matter how powerful they think they are, can be defeated. The community, inspired by his stand, began to rally together in ways James hadn't seen before. Neighbors who once barely exchanged words now shared stories of their own experiences with the HOA. They supported each other, determined never to let someone like Linda manipulate them again. On a crisp autumn afternoon, James sat under his oak tree, the golden light filtering through its leaves. The yard was peaceful again, untouched and alive with the memories it held. As he sipped his coffee, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the victory, but for the lesson it carried. He glanced around at the backyard that had once felt under siege and smiled. It wasn't just a plot of land, it was a symbol of resilience. The fight had been exhausting, but worth it. His oak tree stood tall, its roots as unshakable as James's own resolve. For James, the moment wasn't about celebration, it was about reflection. He had shown his neighbors and himself that standing up for what's right could make a difference. And as the leaves rustled gently in the breeze, he knew he'd not only saved his sanctuary, but had also inspired others to defend their own.